Yes? Okay. So, good afternoon, or better to say good evening, because this is the last session of TechEd, and you decided to spend your last hour and 50 minutes with me. Thank you. I'm Paolo Pialorsi. Here you can find my email address and my Twitter account. And I will talk with you in this session about deploying Microsoft SharePoint, regardless 2010 or 2013, but we will mainly focus on 2013, on Windows Azure virtual machines. Before starting with the content of the session, let me introduce myself. I'm a consultant. I'm focused on SharePoint since 2001. I'm a Microsoft Certified Solution Master on SharePoint. And during my life, I've wrote some books for Microsoft Press. One, and the latest one, is the SharePoint 2013 Developer Reference. I have 2 last copies of this book to give away during this session, so remind me if I forgot it. Okay. I will find a custom way of delivering them to somebody in the room. And in case of need, keep in mind my email address and drop me an email. I will be really happy to give you an answer if I will have one, of course. So, let's move to the agenda of this session. We will start trying to explain and understand what are the various offerings of cloud available out of the box in the marketplace. We will talk about on-premises, which is not cloud in reality. We will talk about infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service to better understand those names and those ideas. And then we will move our attention to Windows Azure virtual machines, which is a IaaS offering from Microsoft. We will take a look at the architecture and on how it works under the cover. And we will see how to deploy a virtual machine on Windows Azure with some tips and tricks during the session. But our main topic is to deploy SharePoint on Windows Azure virtual machines. So we will move the focus on SharePoint 2013. But as I told you while starting, many of the ideas I will share with you in this session can be applied also to SharePoint 2010. And then we will finish with some best practices and suggestions from the field, because as I said in the description of this session, I have already deployed quite a lot farms, SharePoint farms on Windows Azure VMs. So I think I have something to give you back from this session to better create your own SharePoint infrastructure on Windows Azure. So, let's start explaining the cloud in a few words. Think about the various hosting models we have available in the marketplace. The first hosting model option we have is the so-called on-premises hosting model. Well, when you leverage the on-premise hosting model, in reality, you are doing all by yourself. So, you are managing the networking infrastructure, the storage, the servers, the physical servers, the virtualization engine on top of the physical servers, as well as the operating system of your virtual machines. Of course, you have also to manage some middleware stuff and the runtime of your application or software, including the data on the backend of your custom application that usually are hosted on your on-premises machines. So you have to do all by yourself. Great power, great responsibility. You also have another option, which is called infrastructure as a service, which allows you to use a managed by someone else networking, storage, server, and virtualization infrastructure, and provides you only the task to define the operating system of your virtual machine, the middleware, the runtime, the data, and the applications. In this offering, you have less power, but you have something managed by someone else and monitored by someone else. So it could be a good option. You have to evaluate. Or you can also have the so-called platform as a service offering, where you only take care of the data layer and of the applications you are running on your environment, where the platform, that means everything under the data, is provided to you by someone else, and you pay on an hour, minute, monthly basis someone else to provide you such a service. There is one more option, which is called software as a service, where you have also the data and the applications running with that data provided to you by someone else. Again, it could be Microsoft. And you simply have, just in case of need, you simply have to customize an already out-of-the-box available application with an already out-of-the-box provided infrastructure and platform to run your customization. So you will only have to focus your attention on customizing something provided to you as a service, as a software as a service. So, from a SharePoint perspective, how does hosting model apply? Well, in the on-premises scenario, you have to do everything. The hardware and the software are under your control. You have to do everything. You have to install, to choose the hardware, to choose the software, to install everything. And you have to roll your own high availability rules, as well as your disaster recovery and scaling rules. It's everything on your charge. You can do whatever you want, but you have to do that. In the infrastructure as a service offering, you can leverage an IT infrastructure provided by someone else, which could be Microsoft, and you can deploy your SharePoint environment on top of a set of virtual machines which will be executed, which will run on an infrastructure that is provided to you out of the box. You still have to deploy your high availability plans, disaster recovery plans, as well as you still have to think about the scaling rules of your farm, because it will be your option to have 1, 2, 3, or many servers in your infrastructure. The only benefit you will have from the provider providing you the infrastructure as a service is the underlying infrastructure, of course. Or, from a SharePoint viewpoint, you can also think about the so-called software as a service, which in the field of SharePoint is, for instance, Microsoft Office 365, which is exactly a software as a service provided by Microsoft and managed by Microsoft. So, with Office 365, you have everything managed by them, managed by Microsoft, and you don't have to take care of high availability, disaster recovery, or scaling. It's all on charge of Microsoft, and you simply pay on a monthly basis for the number of users you have. So now, move our focus on the infrastructure as a service offering provided by Microsoft through Windows Azure and through the Windows Azure virtual machines, to better understand how they work. Windows Azure VM is the official offering by Microsoft in Windows Azure for providing IaaS services, infrastructure as a service services. It is globally available on the marketplace. It's fully functional. You can use it. You can leverage it to deploy either a lab or a production environment. It's up to you. It's absolutely a good option to deploy a lab, because it's really easy. I will show you later in a few minutes. And it could be also a good option to deploy a production farm, in particular if you are creating a farm, a SharePoint farm, for hosting a web content management site. And you need a lot of bandwidth and a lot of capability to manage high traffic with high number of users. Okay? So keep in mind. I will show you why. Through Windows Azure VM, you can create not only virtual machines, but you can also create virtual networks. Virtual networks will make your virtual machine within the same virtual network with a set of private IP addressings and with a public address to achieve your virtual machine from the network, from internet, just in case you want, of course. And you can connect your virtual networks on Windows Azure with your on-premises networks using a virtual private networking infrastructure. So you can create a VPN between the virtual machines on Azure and your own stuff on premises. So let's say you have something inside your network and something outside, you can join and merge them. When you create virtual machines in Windows Azure, you can start from scratch, from an empty and clean virtual machine based on one of the available operating systems provided by Microsoft. I will show you which are the out-of-the-box available OS. Or you can also start from a set of VM models that you can create by yourself. And you can store on Windows Azure to create multiple virtual machines based on the same model. And this is a really cool feature. To tell the truth, I use it quite often because many times customers have the same needs. I have a set of models available, and I always start from my models. Lastly, you can completely manage your VMs from remote, from your own environment, using PowerShell. So it's really a powerful set of tools that you have in your hands. When you create a virtual machine, you have the option to create your virtual machine using a web-based management portal. We will see it in the next demo. But you can also use some scripting code, for instance, some PowerShell code. And we will use PowerShell in the second demo we will see. Or you can also leverage a REST-based API that is provided by Windows Azure in general, and also by the Windows Azure VMs service. When you create a VM, you have a set of operating systems available. Here you can see the most famous and the most available kind of operating systems. In reality, since a few days ago, I guess a couple of days ago, Microsoft announced during the keynote of the Build conference, which is in parallel of this one in San Francisco, the availability also of Windows Server 2012 R2 preview, as well as you will find sooner or later some other basic model of operating system for virtual machines. Take a look at the press releases of Microsoft during the last days for further information. And when you choose an operating system to start from, then the only thing that the infrastructure as a service will provide you will be copying the virtual hard disk of the model you choose into another blob storage-based storage virtual hard disk, and will start your virtual machine based on that disk. From a Windows viewpoint, which is the most interesting when you want to deploy a SharePoint farm, the VM models available out of the box are those listed in this slide. Okay? So Windows Server 2012 and 2008 R2 SP1, as well as virtual machines with already on board SQL Server 2008 and 2012. To tell the truth, since 2 days ago, there is also SQL Server 2014 in Community Technology Preview. You have Bitstall Server, and from our viewpoint, because we are SharePoint guys, if we are in this room, we also have a SharePoint Server 2013 trial model. What does that mean, trial? It will expire on the 16th of December of this year. So you have a 6-month, almost a 6-month. It depends on when you will create the virtual machine. But they created the virtual machine on the 16th of June. So you have 6 months from that date to check, test, play with SharePoint without having a real license. Because the virtual machine you will create starting from that model will have an eval license of SharePoint 2013 Enterprise. Okay? So it's really interesting. Again, since 2 days ago, there is also another VM model available, which is the Visual Studio 2013 preview model, which in reality is not just a preview of Visual Studio 2013, but there is also SharePoint eval available in that model. So starting from 2 days ago, my suggestion is if you want to play as a developer on SharePoint, my suggestion is to create a VM starting from the Visual Studio 2013 model. Or if you want to play with a real SharePoint farm with real SharePoint roles distributed across multiple machines, use this one. Okay? So, let me show you how the game works. Let me change the video source. Okay, you can see my virtual machine, my physical machine, sorry. And let me go to Windows Azure. In order to go to Windows Azure, the website is www.windowsazure.com. Okay? From this site, you can access the web-based management portal, which is located here as a link. And you can provide your credentials, your Microsoft account credentials. Let me log on with my own credentials. And here I will have all the available services provided by Windows Azure. And I will focus my attention on the virtual machines service. Which is the one in the second position, this one. As soon as the hyphen will disappear and the number of VM will appear, I will be able to click on this item. Okay. So far, in the currently selected subscriptions, I have 11 virtual machines. Here I have one virtual machine, which is based exactly on the Visual Studio 2013 preview I told you before. I have another virtual machine, which is used only for development purposes, and it's stopped so far and deallocated. I will explain you what does that mean later. And then I have some other virtual machines which made up a whole farm, a whole SharePoint 2013 farm. Here, if you want to create a virtual machine from scratch, you simply need to click the New button, Virtual Machine. You can create a virtual machine from the Quick Create panel, which is really quick but not that powerful. But you simply need to provide a name, which should be unique, a model, a sizing. We will talk about sizing in a few minutes, and a username and password for the admin user, as well as a location and a subscription to charge for this VM. I will not talk about prices, okay? It's not my topic. So we will not talk about prices. We will talk about functionalities. If you want, you can create a VM from the gallery. And here you have the platform images that are the images provided out of the box by Microsoft. There are several, as you can see. And there is the Visual Studio Ultimate 2013 preview, for instance. Or you can also use your own images or disks in order to create VMs starting from an already created VM or VM model. Let's say I want to create a new VM running SharePoint 2013 and Visual Studio Ultimate 2013. I click Next. I provide a name, which can be SP 2013 Demo 03. Let's see if it's unique. I have to make a choice about the sizing of my machine. You probably know that a SharePoint VM needs a little bit of memory. I need to provide a username and a password. Then I have to provide a name for the host that will be used to represent the VM from outside, from the internet network, and that will be also the name of a cloud service that will be created for hosting my VM. Because under the cover of the virtual machine in Windows Azure, there will be a cloud service. So let me provide, for instance, the same name as before, and let's see if it's already used by someone else. No, it's free. I have to define a storage account, so where I want to save the VHDs, so the virtual hard disks of my virtual machine. I can select to create a new storage, or use an already existing one. And I have also to make a choice about where to place my VM in a specific virtual network that I already have defined, or in a data center somewhere around the world, let's say in North Europe. I have to make someone pay for me. So the account, the subscription, will be this one. And I'm almost done. I can define an availability set. I will explain you later what is an availability set. So far, I will keep this field blank. And I can enable remote access through PowerShell to my virtual machine or not. It's up to me. OK, I'm done. And it is creating the VM. And now it's working. It will take about 2, 3, 4 minutes. It depends. And then I will have my VM available. And I will be able to access my VM using remote desktop. Let me access the one I have already created just to be faster. And I can simply provide a set of credentials to access by remote desktop my virtual machine. And here it is. This is my VM with Visual Studio, with SharePoint, and whatever else installed on it. And I can play with it. I can play with the local Visual Studio and so on. OK? This way, we can create as many VM as we want. The only thing we need is to have space enough in our subscription. What I mean is that when I create a VM uses a pre-configured number of cores. You can see here my VM. Let me try to zoom it. It doesn't work. OK. I will try to make it visible. You can see I have 4 cores allocated for this VM. On the Cloud Services panel, I have my VM that will allocate, let's say, this one, which allocates 4 cores. I have on the Cloud Services side a cloud service which uses a number of cores, which can be a maximum of 100 cores. So as long as I will allocate a number of cores which is available for my subscription, I will be able to create VMs. Then I will simply need to send a support request to Microsoft in order to enlarge the number of out-of-the-box available number of cores. So you can do whatever you want. OK, so back for a while to my slide deck. In the meantime, it will create my VM for me. The VM is already starting now, just for your information. How it works? Well, I logged into the management portal using the web browser, any web browser, of course. I created my VM starting from a predefined image, chosen from an image gallery. So, starting from the VHD model, the engine of Windows Azure VM copied the VM hard disk to my storage account and started the VM. And whenever I change something on the virtual hard disk of my VM, Windows Azure will save the changes to the blob storage for me. So, just in case of need, in the future, I will be able to download, for instance, my VHDs on my on-premises environment just to have a look or to make a backup or something like that. But we will talk later about backup. When I created my VM, I had to define a size. Well, those are the out-of-the-box available sizes in Windows Azure VM. As you can see, the available sizes have a name, but have also a code. In fact, they started with just 5 sizings: the extra small, the medium, large, and extra large. Then they added the A6 and A7. And probably it would have been funny to name them extra, extra large or extra, 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 extra large, and so on. So they decided to change the naming convention and to use A and the number. OK, it's easier. So you can think about the sizing as A something, starting from A0 to A7. And the sizing determines the number of cores. In A0, you have a shared core, shared with someone else. So you don't have a dedicated core. A1, just one core, A2, two core, and so on. From the memory viewpoint, you can start having 768 megabytes until having 56 gigabytes in the A7 sizing. But more important, probably, the bandwidth. Depending on the sizing, you will have more or less bandwidth for network access from outside to download or upload content to your virtual machines. So if you are planning to publish a high traffic website, probably it will be better to set an A3 or an A4 at least sizing to have a good bandwidth, because a 5 megabit probably could be too less. Moreover, number of data disks. So far, I have created, just for giving you an example, one very simple VM, which will have just one hard disk for the operating system and one secondary and temporary hard disk just for temporary files. We will talk about it later. But when you create VMs, regardless the tool you use, the web UI, PowerShell, or the REST APIs, you can also add additional disks to your VMs, and the maximum number of additional disks depends on the sizing of your VM, as well as the number of I/O per second, because every single VHD will be capable to handle no more than 500 IOPS. So if you want to have a VM with, let's say, 4 virtual hard disks, each up to 1 terabyte in size, you can choose the A2 size with 2 cores, 3 giga and half, 200 megabytes of bandwidth, and 4 disks with 500 IOPS each. So across all of your 4 hard disks, you will be able to gain 2,000 IOPS, 500 for each of your hard disks. And what about business continuity? Let's say, okay, if I have my VMs or if I have my physical machines on my own environment, maybe I can trust myself and say that I have a service level agreement of 3.9, 4.9, well, it depends. It depends on your environment. In Windows Azure, Microsoft guarantees that you will have a service level agreement of 95% of external connectivity for your virtual machines. If you have at least 2 virtual machines, not 1, 2 virtual machines, in load balancing, within the same availability set, which is a topic I will explain in the next slide to make it more clear. And 95% means about 4 and 38 hours per year. That is not that bad if you think about that. It's a good result. It's a good deal. From the VPN connectivity, you will have a 99.9%, so a 3.9 of availability. You can find more information on the URL showed on the slide. But what does that mean if you have at least 2 VMs in an availability set? Imagine that you have 2 web servers hosting IIS and 2 SQL servers in the backend of the web applications running on your IIS servers. Of course, regardless you are on Windows Azure or whatever else, on premises or somewhere else, if you want to have a highly available service, you will probably need to have at least 2 servers in load balancing, because it could happen that you have to upgrade your operating system, to apply a patch, to do a reboot or something like that. Makes sense. But in your own environment, when you are on premises, you should have the two physical or virtual machines in a totally independent environment, so that if a switch goes down, you don't have both the servers plugged into the same switch. If the router goes down, you don't have the same virtual machine plugged into the same router. More in general, you should have all your stuff divided into separate racks, which can be also called fault domains. Because if you have everything duplicated in different racks, you have a good guarantee that probably, even if one of the devices inside one of the racks will fail, the other one will still continue to work. Moreover, also from an update viewpoint, you not only have to update and apply patches to your virtual machines, but probably sometime it will happen that you will have also to update the operating system of your host machines. So again, if you host two web servers, two web front-end within the same virtual host, in case of a reboot of this virtual host, both the nodes will be rebooted with it. So you will lose availability of your service. So again, if you place from a Windows Azure viewpoint your VMs in an availability set, which is an option available from the web UI or from PowerShell, this will guarantee, because the provisioning of your VM will guarantee this result, that your two VMs will be placed on different racks. So you will have your VMs load balanced and placed inside separated fault domains and update domains, so that in case of any update, Microsoft will not apply the update on both the racks, on both the update domains at the same time, but will apply the patch first on one and then on the other. And if you define every single VM as a couple of VMs within an availability set, you will have a 99–95% of availability, of network availability. That means if your own server, the virtual server, the virtualized server, will have any issue from the operating system viewpoint, you will have to fix it. But the VM by itself will be available from a network connectivity perspective. Keep in mind. Because even if you deploy your VM on an infrastructure as a service, you have to manage with your hands the VMs inside the infrastructure. Because Microsoft will not monitor and manage your VM for you. At least, not for free. So, what about SharePoint? Well, let me show you a sample topology schema of a SharePoint 2013 farm, which could be in reality also a 2010 farm in this case, highly available and with a 99–95% of availability. First of all, my suggestion is to have a domain controller on the cloud, a domain controller in the IaaS offering side of the world. And the domain controller probably can be a small machine, not an extra small. I think it's too small, an extra small, but probably an A1 is OK. So you can create an A1 VM, for instance, with Windows Server 2012, and configure this VM as a domain controller and as a DNS in your virtualized network. But in order to have always available domain controllers in your farm, in your virtualized farm, you will need to have also a secondary domain controller with the same sizing within an availability set. So you will have to create two VMs that will be almost the same. There were twins, but placed inside an availability set in order to have those VM in separate fault and update domains. Then, as you know, SharePoint can live only if you have a SQL Server under the cover. So you will need to have a SQL Server VM, which at least should be an A4 or better an A5. It depends on your needs, on the number of users and the traffic you manage to handle with your virtualized environment. But an A4 sometimes could be enough. Again, with Windows Server, 2008 or 2012, it's up to you. With SQL Server, and not any SQL Server, but a SQL Server that can be highly available. So, for instance, you can consider using a SQL Server Standard or Enterprise with a twin node within the same availability set. Again, one more time. Okay? So, even if one of the two SQL Server will fail, there will be the other. But how does it work from a SharePoint viewpoint? You will have to configure mirroring or always-on functionalities and capabilities of SQL Server. And in case of mirroring, the suggestion is to use sync mirroring with a witness. So you will need to have a third small, in this case, a third small SQL Server that can be any SQL Server in reality, that will be the witness of your SQL mirroring, just in case of mirroring, of course. And then what? An application server. In SharePoint, you usually have a dedicated application server to services like the search engine, the user profile service, and many other. Okay, because of the hardware requirements of SharePoint, you should have an A4 or an A5 size VM to host Windows Server 2012, it's my suggestion because it's a new farm, and SharePoint to configure an app server node. Again, with a twin, within another availability set, which will be the availability set of the application servers in your farm. Probably you can't imagine what is going to appear on this slide. A web front end? Really? Oh, what a surprise. A web front end, again, A4 or A5. This will be a server with the web front end role, and again, with a twin inside my last availability set. Such a topology is a highly available and affordable, reliable topology for a basic SharePoint farm. Then, of course, if you want to serve a high number of users or a large number of items inside the search corpus, you will have to add more servers to your environment. But it's up to you, and it depends on your requirements. This is the minimum topology to have high availability and 99–95% of service level agreement for you or for your customers. Okay, so far? It's not that expensive. Don't be scared, okay? If you want to try, go to the site and make a price, and you will see that it's not that expensive. Probably it's cheaper than what you spend now with your own on-premises environment. And so, how can we configure and deploy such a farm using Windows Azure? Let me move back to my laptop. Here I have already created a farm because the deployment of such a farm usually takes about 2–3 hours. That is not time spent only creating the VMs on Windows Azure, but is also time dedicated to configure and deploy and provision all the SharePoint services onto the farm. Okay? So I have no time. I have 1 hour and 15 minutes to show you the contents. So I already created my farm, and I will simply show you step by step all the PowerShell statements that you can use to deploy such a farm by yourself. And all the scripts will be available as demos for this session, but are also already available on my blog in a white paper I put on my blog a few months ago. Okay? So, starting from now, we will spend quite a lot of time using PowerShell. Sorry about that. If you mind, of course. But PowerShell is nice, so don't mind. But before moving to PowerShell, let me show you the result. I have 2 application servers, 2 domain controllers, 3 SQL servers, and 2 web front-end. Exactly what I showed you in the slide. Let's see the domain controllers. The domain controllers are SP 2013 DC1 and DC2, and they are defined within a common availability set. They are small, as I told you, and each of them uses 1 core. Under the cover, Windows Azure created for me a cloud service, which has this name, and which uses 2 cores, which are 1 core for DC1 and 1 other core for DC2. The 2 servers within the same availability set can see each other from a networking viewpoint, but in my specific scenario, I have created also a virtual network, which is available here under Networks, which is called SP 2013 Farm, and which is defined this way. I have 2 DNS servers that are the 2 domain controllers I have in my virtualized network. And I have 3 subnetworks, 1 for the domain controllers, 1 for the SharePoint machines, and 1 for the SQL machines. Let me try again the zoom it. No. Okay, it doesn't work at all. Zoom it again. Okay. Zoom. No. Okay, nothing. Let's try this way. Okay. The old one. Okay. The old and legacy one always work. Okay, so here you can see those are my subnets within a unique address space that is 10.50.00.16. So I have configured, still using PowerShell, I will show you how, my virtual network, my subnets, and my DNS servers inside my network. Let's take a look also to the application servers, for instance. They are large. They are in a common availability set, up1 and up2. The same for the web front-end servers. But for instance, the web front-end servers, from an endpoint's point of view, sorry for the trick of words, but have an HTTP-enabled endpoint. As you can see here, all my virtual machines are accessible through RDP, because it's the only way I have to manage those virtual machines from a remote console, and the only other option I have is to use a remote PowerShell. But my web front-end virtual machines will also publish an HTTP endpoint on the public port 80 against a private port still 80, load balanced, because I have 2 VMs load balanced under the same protocol, under the same TCP protocol with the same public port. So, if you want to consume this farm, this is an address which is fake, is configured only locally on my machine. There is no test top-level domain. But this output is coming out from my web front end. Okay? Trust me. You have to trust me so far. Let me connect using RDP to my application server. I simply need to choose the server and click Connect. I will open the remote session. I hope I typed the right password. Securing remote connection. Okay, it was the right password. And sooner or later, we will have the VM console. Okay, I'm on my remote application server, and I want to show you the result before commenting the whole PowerShell script. I want to show you the result. Here I have a set of web application configured in my virtualized farm. Under the system settings, I can show you that I have a set of servers. I have 2 application servers. I have 2 web front-end servers, and I have a SQL server, which is under an alias, so I see only the alias of my redundant SQL server. Then, for instance, I have that my 2 application servers, let me try to use the zoom, both are running the central administration. This is the app1 server. This is the app2 server, which is running the central admin as the first one. Because keep in mind, if you want to have a really highly available server farm, you should make all the services redundant, even the central admin. There is a nice and really useful blog post from Spence Arbor on his blog about how to configure a redundant central administration in SharePoint. I have my 2 web front-end servers, both running the SharePoint Foundation, web application service. You can see here and here. Okay? So those are the front ends, and let me exit from the zoom. And those are the application servers. Moreover, I have under the service applications configuration page the search engine, where I can see that both app1 and app2 host all the available roles for the search engine of SharePoint 2013. So, in case of failure of any of the 2 servers, the other one will be still available with all the component for my farm. And so on. You have to think about that and to replicate all your services in order to have high availability of your farm. So, how can I achieve this kind of result? Starting from now, we will spend some minutes inside PowerShell. I have just started PowerShell is editor as an admin, and let me open a script that will deploy my farm. First of all, the font is okay also from the back or not? Can you see it? It's big enough? Okay, thank you. So, first of all, I have to install the extensions for Windows Azure for PowerShell. Here in the script, you can find the URL you can use to download and configure your own environment to do that. Then, I will be able to configure my own environment to execute the PowerShell extension for Windows Azure, which are remotely signed by someone else, which is Microsoft, and that's why I'm setting this execution policy. So let me press F8 to run these 2 lines of code. Then, I need to reference my current subscriptions. It's a plural noun, subscriptions. All of my subscriptions associated with my own account. So, I have to invoke the commandlet get Azure publishing setting file. Let me show you the result. It will drive me to a web page where I will have to make logon. I am already logged in because I'm in the management console. And from this page, I will be able to download a file, here it is, which is a publishing settings file, which contains all the information to remotely manage my subscriptions. I already have such a file, so I simply cancel the request. And as soon as you will have saved your file somewhere on your own file system, you will be able to import that publishing setting file. Now I'm ready to work. And to do what? Here are some pieces of scripting just to play with my subscription. For instance, I can retrieve the list of all the subscription available in my publishing setting file. Are a lot, so I don't want to bore you showing all of them. But the important part is here. I define the name of the subscription that I want to use, and I select it. Then I have to define where I want to place my VMs. I mean, what will be the data center on which I will create my VMs. Here is the list of all the available data centers. West US, East US, and so on. North Europe, West Europe, Southeast Asia, and so on. Usually, I'm in Italy. I work with North or West Europe, but it's up to you, of course. Let's say I want to work in North Europe. Here I simply define some variables that will declare the data center as well as the affinity group, which is a topic we have not yet touched in this session, but we will talk about the affinity group after this demo. By now, consider that in order to have better performances, you can ask to Windows Azure to place all of your VMs within the same set of cluster inside the same unit, inside the same container for better performances. We will talk about this later. Then, if I don't have an affinity group, which is the default case if you are starting from scratch, you can create one using this command-let, new affinity group. You define the location of your affinity group, a description, a name, and a label. And you are done. Then, before creating all of your virtual machines, you have to create and configure your virtual network. So, you will need to have an XML file, like this one. Still okay, the font size? This file declares that we have a virtual network configuration with one or more DNS servers configured, with a name mapped to a dedicated affinity group, which will be my affinity group, with an address space, which is the one I showed you from the web management UI, and with one or more subnetworks, which will be my free subnetworks, as well as a reference to my DNS server. You can set a new virtual network based on this configuration using the set Azure VNet config command-let. Or you can retrieve the already provisioned network configuration using the get Azure VNet config and selecting, for instance, the XML configuration. Here you can see that in my real configuration, of course, I have 2 DNS servers and 2 DNS server references. So that whenever I will create a new VM, this new VM will get through a DHP server the right IP address in the right subnet with the properly configured DNS server automatically for me. Sorry. Move on. Now I have the network, I have the affinity group. I can create my virtual machines. But in order to create a virtual machine, I need to have a storage account on which I will save all the virtual risks of my VMs. So I define a name for my storage account, a label, and I create a new Azure storage account using the corresponding command-let. Again, in the same affinity group for performance reasons. And this will be the URL of my blob storage storing my VMs. So if we go back to the Windows Azure Management Portal, here I can see that I have the SP 2013 Lab 01 farm storage, which under the cover contains a set of containers, in reality just one, with a lot of VHDs inside for all my virtual machines. And now I have to define username, password, and so on. Those are fake passwords. Don't try to write them and to brute force my servers, okay? But here I define the administrative account and the password that I will use for my local admin account as well as for the domain admin account. And now I'm really, really ready to create my VMs. But if you remember, when I created my VM using the management portal, I had to choose a model to start from. With the get Azure VM image command, you can retrieve the list of available VMs models. There are a lot. There are many, as you can see. The last one is the Visual Studio 2013 preview I showed you before. And here you have the Windows Server, and so on, the SQL Server, the SharePoint trial machine, and so on. So I simply define the name of my VM models that I will use to create my VMs. And now, step by step, I have to create my VMs inside my farm. So first of all, I need to create my domain controllers. I need to provide a name, a label, and a description for the cloud service that will host my VM, my domain controller VMs. And then I define a DC1 VM, which is no more than the result of invoking the new Azure VM config commandlet, providing the name of the virtual machine, the availability set in which I want to place my VM, which is a variable I defined earlier, somewhere here. Okay, here. I define the image to start from, the model, the size, which will be small, the label, and the media location, which will be the URL of the VSD of the system disk. And then I can also, using the pipe, apply some other configurations to my VM. For instance, I set the Windows password of my VM, as well as I add another virtual hard disk to my VM for storing Active Directory informations. And then I set, still with the pipe, I set my VM inside the domain controller subnet, so that as soon as Windows Azure will provision and create my VM will be created and it will have assigned an IP address inside the domain controller subnet. I do exactly the same thing for the other domain controller. This bunch of script is exactly the same as before. The only difference is that we have a DC2 instead of DC1. And then I'm ready to create those two VMs inside a unique cloud service through the new Azure VM commandlet. New Azure VM, name, label, and description of the service, the affinity group where the VMs will be placed and the cloud service will be placed, the network, and the VMs that will belong to this cloud service. And I'm done. Now, after a few minutes, I will have two virtual machines hosting my domain controllers. But before creating all the other VMs, I will have to provision the Active Directory services on both of them. I can still do the same thing using PowerShell from remote, or I can simply connect through RDP, from the remote desktop client to my VMs, and by hand, using the UI, I can provision the Active Directory services onto the two domain controllers. And then I can create two DNS servers that I will use to provision all the other VMs. So, after that, I can start creating all the other virtual machines. And there is a very tricky but important thing to know in order to properly create all the other virtual machines that will join automatically in my domain controller only if my Active Directory and my domain controller, only if I will provide a specific statement while creating them. So let me show you how I create the SharePoint server, and all the other machines will be almost the same. Again, I define the name, the label, and the description of my cloud service that will host my web front-end VMs in this scenario. I declare an array of SharePoint servers that will start with 2 machines, but you can say you want to create 20 machines. It's the same. You can play with this script. And for each of the virtual machines inside my array, I will create a VM, almost the same as before, with a name, an availability set, an image, which can be the SharePoint 2013 image, so that the virtual machine will already have all the bits of SharePoint on their hard disk. It's useful. A sizing, a label, and a media location. But I will have, again, a Windows password for the local administrative account, but I will also provision a custom configuration in order to configure the domain user, and the domain password for these machines in order to join the domain I have just created. Not only, but I can also put my VMs inside the directory schema within a specific organizational unit. And usually I do that, because usually I define an organizational unit to host my SharePoint servers. Moreover, I configure the subnet, but also I configure the HTTP endpoint load balanced that will be load balanced with the other web front-end. So for each and every web front-end I'm going to create using this script, I also configure an Azure endpoint with name HTTP, with a specific protocol and port, local and remote, and with a name for the load balanced endpoint. I also provide a protocol, a port, and a relative URL to query in order to check if the node is available or not, so that the load balancer will be able to determine if my VM is available to respond to users or not. And as soon as I will have created all the VMs inside the SharePoint server, SharePoint front-end server array, I can create another cloud service which will host the 2 or my 3, 4, it depends, virtual machine working as web front-end roles. The same for the application servers, but they are not published using any endpoint. And the same for the SQL Server virtual machines, where I will create my SQL Server virtual machines with a rich set of virtual hard disks, because I want to have a virtual hard disk for the data files, another one for the log files, and another one for the temp files. And please, even if every VM in Windows Azure, out of the box, has a system hard disk and a temporary storage hard disk, this temporary storage hard disk has not to be used for the temporary database of SQL Server. Do not use it for the temporary database of SQL Server, because this temporary disk is the only disk in your VM which will be not saved on the blob storage, but only on the storage local to the cluster running your VM, and is here just for instance, the swap file or temporary file that will be lost as soon as you will reboot your VM. So don't place the SQL temporary DB on this folder, on this disk, but create another one. Okay, I create also the witness with the same kind of script. and I'm done. I will have all my virtual machine. And then I will have to provision all the SharePoint environment. Of course, this session talks about deploying SharePoint on Windows Azure, but is not a session about how to deploy a SharePoint farm. However, I will provide you with a set of PowerShell scripts to deploy also the SharePoint farm with the proper services, the health service, the management data service, the user profile, and so on, but just for the sake of completeness. I will not show them here in this session, but you can find them, you will be able to find them in the demos of this session, and also on they are explained also in the white paper on my blog. So, back to the slide deck for a while. Let me give you some last few information to better manage all this stuff. First of all, use affinity groups. An affinity group allows the Fabric controller, which is the engine which provisions your virtual machines, to keep compute and storage, only compute and storage services, as close as possible. That means within the same container, or even within the same cluster, if it is possible. And through affinity groups, you gain better performance, less latency, and you lower also the cost because you have no traffic outside your unit. So you can gain also better cost and not only better performances. When you create your virtual hard disks, keep in mind that you can also enable caching. You can enable caching from the web UI management interface, or you can create or configure this caching using PowerShell. The available options are none, that means no caching, of course, read-only cache or read and write cache. You can configure caching for up to 4 disks in your VM. So if you have a VM with 8 disks, you can only enable cache on 4 of them. And keep in mind, as a suggestion, that you should not use caching on virtual hard disk for SQL Server virtual machines. And still on the performances of disks, keep in mind that if you need to have high traffic scenario with high traffic and a high number of input-output on your hard disks, you can use multiple hard disks up to the maximum number you have in your VM size, and you can have 500 IOPS for each of those hard disks. So if you configure from the Windows operating system viewpoint an array of disks, you can leverage multiple disks under the cover and have a better number of IOPS for your disks. Remember also that when you create VMs, the bandwidth of your VMs depends on the VM size. So probably it's a good choice to have quite a big size on the web front-end machines to have more bandwidth for your end users. Again, if this is a lab, you can simply create it and play with it. But if it is a production environment, what about backup and disaster recovery? You cannot make a snapshot of your VMs when they are Windows Azure VMs. You cannot. So, the only option you have so far is to create a snapshot of the blob storage. But this is a capability that is available only using third-party tools or some scripting. Another option you have for your SharePoint VM is to define a good backup strategy for the SQL database and for the farm configuration. And for instance, upload these backups onto a third-party blob storage separated from your farm in order to have another separated backup that you can also use for downloading the files on premises using, for instance, a VPN between a virtual machine you could have on Azure and your own environment. Or you can simply download the files from the blob storage directly. So let's say you make a backup on a daily basis, and you download through the blob storage those backup files using any tool you have on the market. There are a bunch of tools for reading and writing files from the blob storage. And of course, you can use also the VPN, but be careful about the bandwidth. Lastly, keep in mind that you can reuse your virtual machines either by saving a virtual machine as a model. So if you create a VM on Windows Azure, and then you run the sysprep tool that you can find in the SDK of Windows, you can sysprep your VM, and you have to sysprep your VM, and then you will be able, through the PowerShell console, or again using the management portal, you will be able to create a model from that VM. As a result, your VM will be removed. So be careful. It will be removed, and you will have to provision it again in multiple instances, all based on that model. You can also upload VMs that you create on your own on-premises environment, and you can upload the VHDs to the blob storage and start provisioning a VM from your already existing VHDs. But again, those VMs has to be sysprepped before uploading the hard disks. And you should use the CS upload tool, which is available in the Azure SDK, because this tool will not only upload the file to the blob storage, but will also convert your VHD into a pre-defined size VHD, which is a requirement for Windows Azure VM. Lastly, you have the capability to export and import virtual machines configuration, so that if you don't want to use a virtual machine for a while, you can export the configuration, delete the VM, keeping the VHD, and later, let's say 6 months later, you will be able to import again the configuration and start again from the already existing VHD. But since about 1 month ago, since TechEd in US, that was at the beginning of this month, if I'm not wrong, you can also simply turn off your VMs, and your VMs will be deallocated, as I showed you in my first demo, where I had a VM deallocated. And a deallocated VM has not to be paid. So when your VM are running, you pay on a minute basis. And when your VM are turned off and deallocated, you simply don't pay. Be careful that to deallocate a VM, you have to shut down the VM or from the management console or from PowerShell. If you go to your VM through RDP and you simply make a shutdown, that VM will be stopped but not deallocated. Okay? So you will continue to pay. You have to deallocate the VM, which is an option in PowerShell or an option in the management portal. Okay, that's all for me. Here you can find some related session that you can, or content that you can review using the Channel 9 site. Of course, you cannot find me at the Microsoft booth because now the booth is closed, but you can find me by email. If you want to send me an email, I will be glad to give you an answer. You can consider also Channel 9, TechNet, MSDN, and all the learning options provided by Microsoft. Please evaluate this session. Even if it's the last one, please find some time to evaluate this session. I thank you so much for your attention, and if you have any question, I will be here for a few minutes before they will push out everybody from the room. And so, that's all for me. Thank you so much. See you.